everyone. Welcome to the February 26th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona, TimeformUS Analyst. This weekend on the podcast, we're going to take a look at a weekend that was kind of a lull between big weekends in racing. We just came off of President's Day weekend, and we're just prior to March of 2019, where a lot of the Derby preps are going to be taking place. This last weekend in February, not a whole lot of major graded stakes action taking place, but we'll take a look at some interesting three-year-olds that were in action in Allowance Company, as well as a minor stakes at Sunland Park. We'll also talk about the impact of run-ups on speed figures, on pace of races, and we'll use an interesting example from Tampa Bay Downs to illustrate some points about how run-ups are important to think about in handicapping. And with that, I'll welcome in my co-host, Craig Milkowski, the TimeformUS Chief Figuremaker. Craig, how's it going?
Going well here. I know it seems like every time we're on, I complain about the cold, but we've actually had some nice days, and then in the last hour, it dropped like 20 degrees. So I'm getting tired of this stuff. So it's a nice diversion to do this podcast with you.
Well, I can commiserate with the cold when it comes to wind in the city, because the past couple of days have just been pretty insane. I've almost gotten blown over a few times. It's not too pleasant, but it's a little better today on this Tuesday that we're recording. This weekend, there was not a whole lot of stakes action going on. Actually, I kind of had to do a lot of homework looking through charts to review a lot of these races and find some topics to talk about, as did you. And we'll begin with the three-year-olds this weekend, because there were some interesting performances not in Stakes Company that I think are worth talking about. But we will begin with a minor stakes race that took place at Sunland Park on Sunday, the Mind That Bird Derby, which I guess is the only really official Derby prep, if you can even call it that took place this weekend. And Hustle Up, who is now an 8-time winner in 10 starts, got the job done.
He did. He's going to get about a 106 TimeformUS speed figure. My assistant just sent me the worksheet this morning, finishing that up. Pretty solid, easy day to make figures for. We're going to talk about another horse on that card a little later on. But, Hustle Up, he opened up, got a clear, easy lead. He won wire to wire. That 106 isn't something that's really going to blow me away as far as taking him as a serious horse on the Derby trail. He definitely would need to do some more. He'll face, obviously, some better horses when the Sunland Derby comes around and they start handing out Derby points. The winner generally will show up in the Derby if he stays healthy. I think we missed that last year, but not a strong field. I'm sure some people will be on this horse's bandwagon, but I'd have to see a lot more.
Yeah, this was kind of a funny one. Doing this podcast, I'm not always aware of a lot of what's going on the other circuits. I mostly focus on the NYRA circuit, and that's been my, where I look at my handicapping, where I generally focus on watching replays. So I didn't know anything about this horse going into the race, Hustle Up. I mean, he was 7 for 9 coming into this Mind That Bird Derby. I watched a couple of his races. He's a horse that's very fast, and ever since they stretched him out in distance, he gets extremely headstrong in his races. Just watching this race, going into the first turn, and the jockey really had a tough time kind of getting him to settle down, and it looked like he was going to have trouble getting the distance, but it turned out the pace wasn't all that fast, and he was able to see it out. He's a horse that actually, if you look at his TimeformUS speed figures coming into the race as opposed to something like his Beyer numbers, he's the kind of horse that's really flattered and looks much better on the TimeformUS speed figure scale, because his past performances are just littered with red color-coded pace figures throughout all of his running lines. He's a horse that had been involved in a ton of fast paces, and his higher TimeformUS speed figures kind of illustrate that fact. Like you said, I don't know where this horse is really going from here, but he's just a kind of a cool horse taking, on a minor circuit who's just won a lot of races.
Yeah, and I did read that, they're looking forward. They think they have a Derby horse in them. I like to see a bigger number when horses come from minor circuit. I generally don't even want to see competitive. I want to see numbers that look better than the competition when they step up in class. And I don't think we're getting that here. He's probably going to have a hard time getting an easy lead. And like you said, he's headstrong. So he doesn't look like the kind of horse that's going to be able to relax and sit off of somebody that challenges him. So nice horse. I'd love to own him, but hard for me to take him too seriously.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't think he made a big splash on the Derby trail this weekend, but two horses that did garner a lot of attention are Maximum Security and Spinoff, who both won allowance races. We'll start with Maximum Security, who won at Gulfstream on Wednesday in a 7-furlong allowance race. I mean, he won by a gigantic margin. I think it was over 18 lengths. We gave him a 112 Timeform US speed figure, though I did notice looking through the charts, his raw final time number for this race was actually a 118. So the only reason it came down a little bit for the final figure is, due to the fact that the pace was not that fast. But Jason Service has been winning everything. His horses have just been running out of their skin for weeks, it seems, especially at Gulfstream. And I don't know how they got away with running this horse for 16,000 in his first start, but he seems bound for bigger and better things moving forward.
He does. I remember after I think it was the horse's first race at Gulfstream when he won an allowance race. I jokingly tweeted early favorite for the Breeders' Cup Sprint because he really looked good. But he does still look like a sprinter to me. I hear they're going to try him in the Florida Derby next. It's going to be quite a jump going to 9 furlongs. The good news is he did rate a little bit. Like we said, the fractions were on the slow side. We have the half mile and the 6 furlong fractions coded in blue in our past performances. So, it wouldn't be out of the question that this horse could stretch out his speed another 2 furlongs, but I'm always skeptical of this kind, and I definitely will be wanting to bet against him come Florida Derby time. I think he's probably, it'll be a strong field for sure. We're going to see the Fountain of Youth is coming up this weekend. Surely some horses will look good in there and move on to the Derby, but this horse just looks like one that's going to take some money to me. I don't think he'll be a favorite, but if he's a 7-2, 4-1 shot, he's the kind I'll throw out and just try to eliminate the takeout with one horse.
Yeah, he's kind of a weird horse in that, that $16,000 maiden claiming race that he won in his debut, one of the stronger cheap maiden claiming race I've ever seen, because I think the third place finisher also returned and won another maiden race and then also won an allowance race by something like 18 lengths following that. So, horses out of that race have been okay. It's just kind of amazing that Jason Service snuck this one by and he didn't get claimed that day. Seems like Gary and Mary West have a few of these homebreds that they allow to, run for these maiden claiming prices in their debuts, and some of them actually turn out to be okay. This one is certainly more than okay. And as for the stretch out in the Florida Derby, I kind of agree with you. He looks more like a sprinting type when you watch him, but he's certainly bred to stretch out. He's by New Year's Day, and his dam is actually a 3/4 sister to Flat Out. So, there's plenty of stamina on top and bottom in this pedigree. It's going to be interesting to see. He's an intriguing horse moving forward into these Grade 1 races in the final round of preps. I don't know what we're going to get from him, but I think you always have to respect anything Jason Service is sending out. Another horse, another horse we're probably going to see moving forward into the next round of preps. I think he might even be willing back in 2 or 3 weeks. Is Spinoff, who ran at Tampa Bay Downs on Friday. And this is a similar move, one that Todd Pletcher's used in the past with horses like Always Dreaming and Magnum Moon. John Velasquez came in to ride this horse in his return race, and he was certainly visually impressive. Not the fastest race, but he looked good doing it.
He did. He got a 108 Timeform US speed figure. The pace was really solid. The quarter and half miles were over 120, 125-ish. So he pressed a fast pace. He won easy. He wasn't facing a whole lot. It's the 3 to 5 odds he was that they kind of indicate. And he won like you would expect. But I'm sure he will move forward in either Tampa Bay Derby or Surface. Hard to say with Todd Pletcher. He could wind up anywhere. But seems like the logical spot would be the Tampa Bay Derby. He would definitely need to get better. But you kind of expect that with Todd Pletcher's horses. He spots them where they can win. So I'll kind of take my cue by where he shows up next.
Yeah, I was reading in the post-race comments, he's already talking about coming back as quickly as the Tampa Bay Derby, which would be just over 2 weeks, I think, which is a little out of character for him. But if he's feeling good about this horse and he feels like he didn't have that hard of a race, perhaps it makes sense. This is a horse I remember from Saratoga last year. He had run pretty slowly in his debut at Gulfstream over the summer, and he came back in the Saratoga Special and took a little money that day in that small 4-horse field. He finished third, but he was kind of against the pace in that race. I know there was some buzz around him in the mornings. A lot of Todd Pletcher's 2-year-olds at Saratoga just didn't pan out, but he was reportedly working well coming into that race, and he just kind of disappeared for a long time. And he looked good in this race, still pretty unfocused, still pretty green. I guess you can compare him to a horse like Global Campaign, who also won an allowance race at Gulfstream geared down. what I do like about Spinoff as opposed to Global Campaign is that Spinoff seems to still have some things to figure out, whereas Global Campaign ran a very professional race. Spinoff was anything but professional in this race. I mean, he had his ears pricked forward. He was just kind of looking around. John Velasquez even said after the race that this horse kind of had no idea what he was doing out there. So he's still got some things to figure out, and he still has to show he can, rate off multiple horses. But I like what I've seen from this horse, and his pedigree says that the sky's the limit because his dam Zaftig is one of the fastest 3-year-old fillies I can remember in recent years. Her Acorn, when she won over a big favorite that day, I'm forgetting who it is, like a number of years ago, but she was a really nice filly, and she's thrown a good foal in Rugby Man, so this one has the potential to be okay.
Yeah, and I think that's what you want to see when you see a speed figure like the 108 we gave him. You want to look and see some room where you could see some growth. You don't want to see him run perfect and professionally and only record that 108. So, he definitely, of the horses we talked about, I probably like him the most of the three. And I do want to make one point about that. He ran a 108. If you look back in our charts, you'd see he last ran a 98 in August. So just kind of a side note as we talk about these horses, when 3-year-olds come back from a layoff, you generally can expect some definite improvement. Don't expect them to run similar figures if they're horses you think are moving in the right direction. And this seemed like a promising colt. So I certainly wouldn't project him as a speed figure maker to run a 98 in his first time back. And as a bettor, I wouldn't either. So.
Especially when you're dealing with Todd Pletcher, who just has outstanding numbers off layouts with these types of horses. Yeah, this horse was getting some experience, but he obviously was going to take a step forward in this race, and I'm interested to see where it goes from here. We'll stick with Tampa Bay Downs for a second because there was some interesting timing issues on Saturday that I know you wanted to touch upon. So I'll let you talk about it. Some turf races where the fractions were very different and the races played out visually differently. And I think there's a reason for it.
Yeah, there was, when I sat down to do the speed figures for Tampa on Sunday morning, I noticed two races that were projected to run very similar, races 7 and 9. I think they were both starter allowance races, one for fillies and one for colts. And what struck me was how much faster the filly race was than the colt race. And it just seemed a bit out of place to me. So I did some work, and I also noticed somebody on a Pace Advantage message board, a board I read often and participate in. Somebody had questioned the timing, and knowing it was a turf race and we get these wild swings in final time that often just aren't very indicative of the horses in the race. I went ahead and timed the race. It was a 1 1/8 race. The rail was out at 30 feet, and sure enough, the timing of the race was fine. I timed it from the gate. I timed it from where the timing started, and it checked out in both cases as about 1.5 seconds faster, which, if we were talking a dirt race, that would be an eternity. But I did notice a couple things. We'll get to the run-up in a minute. But the one is, and I think most people who have gotten into turf racing have realized race 9, despite being slower, finished quite a bit faster than race 7 did. And I think that's the key. And we try to capture that in our figures. And I just wanted to stress the point. We talked about the slow pace race at the fairgrounds last week. I think it was the Mine Shaft?
Yeah, that's it.
And how we arbitrarily kind of bumped it up because we just think the pace had a big influence on the final time. And in this case, we actually are bumping down the 7th race to more in line with what the horses did. And the reason for that, I mean, there were 5 turf routes run at Tampa that day. And if I rated this horse, and used the track speed for all the other races for this one, I'd be telling our customers that these are grade 3, even grade 2 type fillies. And I just don't think that's the case. I think it would be a disservice. And I think what happened is this is a race where the pace was just fast enough that a lot of horses got sucked along, and they probably ran about the best final time that they possibly could. But I just don't think it's indicative of what the horses can do. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that before we move on to the run-up topic a little bit.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up the pace because I was actually going to make that same point about the Mine Shaft handicap. It's funny. People get so offended and up in arms when they notice a dirt race that went slower than another dirt race and received a higher speed figure. It's like, blasphemous. But on the turf, people don't seem to care as much, or they barely even notice when it happens because it's so prevalent. And, you don't see this just because turf races take place in the twilight zone. It's almost always due to pace. On turf, you can have huge variances in pace. Horses that go quickly on the front end tend to generate quicker final times, and horses tend to let slower paces. They go much slower final times. And on the turf, you can see a horse go 50, 51, 52 to the half in a route race. And on the same card, a horse could go 46 or 47 to the half. And you just don't see these things happen on the dirt because speed is so much more valuable on the dirt. And, horses that when they run final times on the dirt, it's usually indicative of their overall ability. So it's easier to make comparisons and make speed figures in dirt races without, looking at the class of horses or making adjustments for pace like you did with the Mineshaft handicap last weekend at the fairgrounds. On the turf, with those big differences in the paces of races, it's just something that needs to happen quite often for accurate speed figures that have some usefulness moving forward to be made and published in the past performances. And, I don't think, there's any question that, these races had to receive final speed figures that are kind of flip-flopped, as to the horse's ability with regards to the final times of these races, because those fillies in race 7, as you were saying, just aren't of that same quality. And it was all due to the fact that they set a much faster pace. And people will notice that the first quarter miles of these two races were relatively similar, and that's something that's you're not really used to seeing. Usually in turf races, when they go a slow pace, that first quarter is slow and they just proceed to get slower from there. But there's a reason for those first quarter miles being similar. I'll let you touch upon that.
Yeah, when I time these races, I always look to see what the run-up's listed as. And in this case, it was listed as 40 feet. And it's clearly in error here. The run-up is probably in excess of 200 feet. I think what happened is a mistake was made. They listed what the run-up is when there's no temporary rail. But the rail was at 30 feet. So when you start adding that extra rail distance, the start of the race actually moves way up. But what happened in this case is the gates was in the exact same place as if the race were 1.125 miles with no temporary rail. So the run-up was in effect really much, much longer than the 40 feet that was listed. So what happens, even when the pace is slow, these horses are basically at full speed for the entire quarter mile that you're running. So it's not a big surprise that even and I'm doing the air quotes here, slow pace 9.3s had a quick first fraction. It definitely had more to do with the run-up in this case than it did with the actual urgency of the jockeys coming out of the gate. It was just more of a function of the run-up than anything else.
Yeah, I think the run-up example that most handicappers and race watchers are aware of is that situation at Churchill Downs with the 6 furlong races, where you just always see those 21 and change, sometimes even 20 and change first quarter miles on the dirt, going 6 furlongs to Churchill Downs because of the way that the racetrack is configured and the gap with the far turn. The gate just has to be placed further back than at most other tracks, and it creates a much longer run-up into the first quarter mile. And even though it's a route race, the same thing holds true on the turf or even dirt routes. You're just going to see faster quarter miles when horses have, more of a run up and a head start to get up to top speed. And, they will eventually slow down. But sometimes in these races, you'll see some of that faster opening quarter bleed over into the second quarter. And when there's a longer run up, that just doesn't happen because you're not timing the first part of the race when the horses are quickening up. So you didn't get that bleed over into the second quarter mile, which is why there was such a big drop off from the first quarter to the half mile. I think in this in the slower pace 9th race, they went 23 and change and then 49 and change. And often a big run up is when you get such a big disparity like that. And yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say exactly. The run-up can have a big difference. And one of the reasons it's good to know the run-ups, and I do want to make the point, is it's always good to check from replay because in my experience, the charts just show what the track says the run-up's going to be. It doesn't show what the run-up actually was. Normally, they're fairly close, but there are definitely some cases where they're not close or there was just a mistake made somewhere. So it is good to verify it. And one of the reasons run-ups are important is, a lot of people I'm sure have read plenty of Andy Byers' books on making speed figures or James Quinn's, and they all have speed charts somewhere. But what you got to do, if you don't know what the run-ups are and taking the difference, so those take into account those differences, you can really make some bad figures for some distances. A good example would be a circuit you're familiar with, Saratoga, where the 6.5 furlong run-up distance is a whole lot different than it is for, say, 6 furlongs and 7 furlongs. And it's a point where you almost have to adjust your speed chart. I think they do it there so they're not starting in the gap. You don't want horses breaking and right in the gap and some of them ducking in and getting in trouble. But whatever the reason is, I just think as a speed figure person, it's really important to know what run-ups are used for all the different distances. And most tracks stay fairly consistent. They're going to stick with the same run-up within a few feet for each distance. But there are some that vary out there quite a bit. So in those cases, I use completely different speed charts. It can get pretty complex, but I do think it's something that handicappers should be aware of. And even for races that are coming up as a bettor, kind of have an idea, especially for tracks that change a lot, like, for example, Gulfstream Park on the turf. They can run a 5 furlong race with a 5-foot run-up and on the same day run one with a 250-foot run-up. So it is good to pay attention to these things. It can give you an edge. It's good to know that a 5 furlong race might be closer to 5.5 furlongs in reality. It's certainly going to favor horses that come from behind a little more than it would if it was a shorter run-up. And it's just something that's probably overlooked, in my opinion.
It really is. And it's something that I think handicappers and even horsemen probably overlook quite a bit because, these 7.5 furlong races at Gulfstream have become so popular and they card a bunch of them and they draw, big fields. But these 7.5 furlong races that they're running, a lot of the time aren't really 7.5 furlongs. They're over a mile. In some cases, they're almost a mile and a 16th because they have to place the starting gate so far back, especially with the movable rails at Gulfstream and, when they're and other tracks as well. It's just a bit of an illusion. It's not really what it seems based on what's printed in your past performances. And, you can turn on, I think, even in Dira Formulator, you can view what the run-ups are. And you can even look at charts and see what run-ups are. But I think it's correct to approach it with a little bit of skepticism, especially when these rails can be moved to different positions. Even at Saratoga on the turf, a race like the Sword Dancer. I know this is something that Pat Cummings has harped on a lot in these marathon turf races at different tracks when you have, races going around 3 turns and the rails are out. The run-ups listed in the chart are often not accurate, and the run-ups when you time the race and where they actually start the timing, they can be half a furlong, even more. I think the Sword Dancer last year was, actually like 12.5 furlongs or even longer because there was such a long run up into the race. And it's something that people are probably not aware of. And it makes assessments of pace difficult. And it's something that is very unique to U.S. racing. It's something that, other countries, they start timing from a stop. And, the first quarter is slower, and that's just to be expected. But we're in the United States able to kind of play around with where the timing starts and how long a race actually is. And it's just a problem that I think we've accepted as being the standard. But it can lead to a lot of confusion and I think misinterpretation.
Yeah, and that's definitely a crusade Pat Cummings is on with his Horse Racing Ideas Foundation, which he's a part of, and I hope he succeeds. Run up, the time has long come and gone for it to go away. There's really no reason for it whatsoever. In 2018, I always say, just tell us how far they ran, how far they really ran, and how long it took them, and we'll take it from there. We don't need these 5 and 10% of a race at times with some of these crazy long run-ups not being timed. It's to the point of absurdity.
Yeah. Run-ups, they can make you crazy if you really think about them, if you really try to make sure that you're viewing every race and every pace situation as accurately as possible. It can just send you down a rabbit hole that takes way too much time. And, it's funny, speaking of run-ups, a track that where run-ups are significant on the dirt, actually, Gulfstream Park going 1 mile, often run-ups are a few feet, I think 5 feet. And one of the graded stakes from this past weekend, the How's Hope, was at a mile at Gulfstream and featured a very fast pace considering how short the run-up is. And a horse that ran huge on the pace the entire way was Prince Lucky, who got, I think, the highest TimeformUS speed figure of the weekend with a 127. I was really impressed by this effort, and I don't know where it came from because he was nothing quite of this ability as a 3-year-old. But boy, he looked better than ever and a major force in the mile division moving forward in his return.
Yeah, that's a slightly different from what we talked about with the 2-year-old coming back. But even in this case, he last ran as a 3-year-old, and I think it was on Belmont Stakes Day or maybe the day before. I think it was Belmont Day where he ran last. And he actually won. So, you're talking about a horse that's probably matured quite a bit over the last 8 or 9 months, whatever it is, since he ran. He ran a 118 that last time he had been out. So a 127, that's not unreasonable of a jump for a horse like this. But to my eye, he was really impressive in a division that looks just dearth of talent right now. He's a horse who wouldn't surprise me if he could step up and be a top player in the older horse division. He looked really good. He fought, like you said, it was a strong pace. He was able to sit right there on it and won easily. Blew away Coppertown and Quip, who ran okay coming, back from a layoff. I've never been a huge Quip fan, but he's a solid enough horse. And, so it was a good win for Prince Lucky.
Yeah, it's funny that Coppertown was the one of the Todd Pletcher pair that took all the money. And I think it's been confirmed at this point that he has some pretty serious gait issues. I think in every one of his 4 starts since returning from this layoff for Todd Pletcher, he's just had gait problems, whether he's been fractious in the gait or he's broken slowly or stumbled. It's just been an issue for him every single time. And again, in this race, he stumbled pretty badly and had to rush up to contest the pace. And, he was never going to win this race, but it didn't help his performance that he had that trouble at the gate. Prince Lucky, they let him go at 7-1. Some would argue that was a short price off his prior form, even though he had run that 118, as you were mentioning, in the Easy Goer. I mean, visually, he just looked like a completely different horse in this Hal's Hope. I mean, he was up on the pace easily throughout. I mean, they went a pretty fast half mile. The half was in 45. I don't think it was color-coded red in the PPs, but that had to be a pretty taxing pace for these horses, as some did close in from the back for minor awards. And he just looked powerful through the stretch. I loved what I saw of this horse. I don't know how far he's going to want to go, but he could be a Met Mile kind of horse moving forward, because I don't know who else is really out there in the handicap division, and he looks like a very effective miler.
Yeah, I agree. I'm really looking forward to seeing where this one shows up next. I was impressed, and sadly, I mean, I don't want to knock Todd Pletcher. He's one of the best trainers out there, but you don't often see his horses come back at 4, especially off a long layoff. I would say a lot more don't produce than do, but this one looks like one of the exceptions, and I'm looking forward to seeing him.
Yeah, he's kind of been a weird horse for Todd, because I think Larry Jones had this horse as a 2-year-old at Parks and some Mid-Atlantic tracks, and he showed some ability back then. I think he won maybe the Pennsylvania Nursery, I want to say, or one of those races, very impressively. And then Todd took this horse over and didn't really improve him that much off his 2-year-old form. I know he got that Easy Goer win in a kind of a desperate finish, but he never kind of took that gigantic leap forward that you would assume off a Todd Pletcher trainer switch. And maybe it just took some time, because he's definitely taken that step forward as a 4-year-old. And it'll be interesting to see where he goes from here, as you were saying. Speaking of horses that have found new leases on life, I mean, what better story is there in the game right now than Vasilika, who's just turned into a win machine, and she racked up another graded stakes win in the Buena Vista at Santa Anita on Saturday. I think she's won 12 of her last 14 now, just a neck shy of 13 out of 14. She's just been, the picture of consistency.
Yeah, you just took the words right out of my mouth. I mean, she just is running her race every single time. She got a nice 122 TimeformUS speed figure from us, which is a solid grade 2 figure for females, and it will definitely can win some grade 1s out there. Just a great story. Kind of goes with, and I'm drawing a blank on the horse that won at Charlestown, the little West Virginia bred from last week that went to and won the Fritchie. Just another one of those cool stories that even as I'm pretty hardcore bettor, but I do have that soft side where I get attached to horses, and she's just a real neat one. It's hard not to like the horses that work their way up from claimers to winning graded stakes races.
It's funny how some claiming type of horses have kind of taken over the California female turf division. Actually, in this race, I counted 3 horses that had previously run in claiming races, all in New York, who have now gone to California, and they're competing in graded stakes races, including Fahan Mora and even English Dancer, who was in this race and has now been transplanted to California. All winners of claiming races on the NYRA circuit, and they're now, graded stakes quality out in California. And they really, it's not just the weakness of those races. I mean, they really have taken big steps forward. Vasilika, she got the right trip in this race because Fahan Mora did go out and set this crazy fast pace and kind of open up and cost herself any chance. She's just a runoff type, and it seems like they just let her go too fast sometimes. And, the fact that the final quarter of this race in the last 2/8, I think went in 12.38 for the penultimate eighth to 11.6 for the final eighth, that just speaks to a race that's kind of collapsing until the closers take it over in that last eighth of a mile. But Vasilika got the job done again, and she's adaptable to any kind of pace situation. So I see no reason why she won't just keep winning.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Fahan Mora, too. She's a horse I did want to briefly touch on. TimeformUS, we do give extra credit for fast paces, but if you have access to our chart, she's a good one to look at because we don't give much extra credit to horses that run off like she generally does. There's no advantage of horses opening up 5 and 6 and bigger leads on turf, so we definitely throttle that back quite a bit for her, and you can see it in her past performances and in the chart we have. So just something I wanted to point out as a side note. While we do reward going fast, we kind of curtail that when horses overdo it, and definitely learned my lesson back, in the years of making this figures that you don't want to reward horses that generally run off. Just cut that back and you'll do just fine with those.
Yeah, I think that's a good point because, at some point she may be able to take advantage of a slower pace, but she's also shown herself to not be able to set those slower paces because she's just kind of uncontrollable in the early going. And you just have to be careful with those horses as handicappers. Before we move on to some other stakes races, as I was watching some of the races from Santa Anita this weekend, especially on Saturday, one race that really caught my eye, I don't know if you watched this race, was the 6th race. It was a maiden special weight down the hill, and Richard Mandela debuted this horse, Galloping Mischief, a first-time starter who just, it looked like a relatively slow pace down the hill, and this horse just kind of ran over the top of the field and was really finishing with a full head of steam. I don't know, where this horse is necessarily going to go from here or how fast the race was. I didn't look up the speed figures. But just from a visual perspective and what seemed like a decent field, this horse looked like a special one with a really nice turn of foot. Just a horse that in watching a bunch of replays really caught my eye. So I'll be looking for that horse in the future. I don't know if you caught that race, Craig.
I did not see that, as that my assistant does Santa Anita, so I didn't really have a reason to watch it. I did pull up the chart just now. The horse got a 95 TimeformUS speed figure. Looking at the pace, it was, I would say, just average, marginal for the race. It was a little above the final time figure, so solid pace, but not something crazy like the race fell apart and he just overran a bunch of tired horses. Looks like a pretty good effort just at a quick glance here.
Yeah, just more from a visual perspective. I mean, it just looked like the horse was kind of shot out of a cannon at the top of the stretch. One of those horses that, to quote the cliche, jumped in at the quarter pole. So just a horse to watch moving forward. And he's going to have to improve, but I liked what I saw on his debut. Sticking with the turf sprinters for a second and moving on to Gulfstream Park, I wanted to talk about the Melody of Colors, which was on the Hal's Hope undercard on Saturday. There were 2 divisions of this race, one for fillies and one for colts. The Melody of Colors was for the 3-year-old fillies, and I just thought this was a really interesting $75,000 stakes race, not only for the winner, but just for the fact that horses seem to ship in from other circuits for this race. John Sadler had a horse coming from California in this race for Hronis Racing. The winner of this race, Play Call, came in from the Fairgrounds. A really competitive field for this minor stakes race, and the winner, Play On, Brad Cox, homebred for the Kleins, ran a 104 TimeformUS speed figure, and she was pretty impressive.
Yeah, she was. This was actually a race I found interesting enough. I did it for our Out of the Gate segment last week, and I actually keyed on 2 horses, Play On being one of them, and the other wound up being a long shot who didn't run much, but I recommended both. Unfortunately, the 3-1 one as opposed to the 25-1 or whatever it was. But the reason I keyed on the race is I just didn't see a lot of speed in here, which is really odd for a 5 furlong stakes race, particularly for 3-year-olds. I mean, it is for any turf sprint at this distance, but for 3-year-olds, most of the time you're getting some really quick horses. And this one just kind of stuck out. And I think it's an interesting race to look at going forward, because although the pace was solid enough, the pace figures were virtually the same as the final time. I think it's kind of a good thing to remember this when you look back. And even though we won't code it in red or in blue as a slow pace, it's one that I'm going to remember as saying there wasn't a whole lot of speed in here. About 50 yards into the race, I thought it was over. I didn't see any way Play On was losing, and that was how it turned out. I'm not always right on those calls, of course, but it played out that way. But, going forward, I'm not sure I'd want to. The horse looked dominant, but I think he had everything his way. And I might lean towards some of the closers. The Mark Cash trainee, Catch a Thrill, ran a nice race. So I'd be a little bit skeptical of this one just because he got such an easy lead going that short distance. That's not going to happen very often.
Yeah, I started doing that horses to watch segment where I take an in-depth look at some replays and talk about trips of horses. And I was considering taking a look at this race when I film that tomorrow, because as you were kind of alluding to, I think you do want to pay attention to some of the closers out of this race, especially Catch a Thrill, who came from, I think, second to last to close for second in this race. She was just making her second start for Milkowski, and she had run well in her debut, and I thought she really showed an impressive turn of foot in the stretch of this race to kind of go against the grain and close for second. And also Ginger Nut, who I believe was fourth, making her first start off a very long layoff for John Sadler. She was the most experienced member of the field. She had run, I think, 8 times in England between the months of April and August as a 2-year-old, which you just don't see in this country. She just was extremely active early on in her 2-year-old season. And she had run a bunch of nice races, going 5 and 6 furlongs over there, stepping up in class for this race. But it was interesting that John Sadler shipped her in for this race. And she had some real trouble on the backstretch, kind of got steadied back and lost momentum, which is something that you just can't overcome in a 5-furlong race where, every step of the running is important. And she ran okay to be fourth, a pretty close fourth. She was just about a length behind Catch a Thrill at the wire. So I think both of those horses are interesting moving forward, and it's a replay to really take a closer look at.
Yeah, I think you'll probably remember. I'm kind of always against these European shippers when they come here for sprints, but she certainly ran well. So, going forward, I'm just going to ignore the European form and go on what she's done here. I think she may want a little bit longer distance than she got in that 5-furlong race, which she'll get if she goes to Keeneland or goes to New York, or, maybe she'll go back to California and go down the hill. I wouldn't want her at 5 furlongs, but she'll be interesting if she shows up in some other spots.
Yeah, sticking with the 3-year-old fillies for a second, on the dirt, we saw New York bred Stones in the Road win the Franklin Square on Saturday at Aqueduct, and this was a filly that kind of surprised me. I know she's been very visually impressive in her races, but she had gotten some favorable pace setups in her prior races. She had ridden one of the strongest golden rails that we've seen the entire winter at Aqueduct on February 3rd. She took advantage of that, was on the rail the entire way, en route to her impressive victory. But, turned out that all the handicappers who were betting against gold rail horses were completely wrong, because she took another step forward, ran the biggest race of her life, and won back again. She looked good doing it, but she did have some things go her way in this race.
Yes, she did. There wasn't much pace on again. The pace figures were fairly slow. It's not going to be blue, I don't believe, but she got 100 TimeformUS speed figures. She looked good. Does show the danger of these lightly raced horses, even when they run with a bias. You really don't always know what you have when they're winning. When horses win easy, it's always a possibility they have some more in the tank. It's usually not the way to bet, but, you're not going to get them all right. I think she was probably a play against here, and sometimes you're going to lose on those spots.
Yeah, it looked like her main rival, who was another horse that was coming off a pair of wins, just had some trouble out of the gate and wasn't herself. And, when the other speed horse doesn't break, it just puts the front runner in the ideal position because they can control and run slower fractions than they otherwise would have. And it just made her very dangerous. I actually thought the runner-up with Dodley Princess ran very well to get second, kind of going against the grain of the race to close into what was a relatively slow pace. So she's one to watch moving forward in some of these New York bred races. Maybe if she drops back down to allowance company, she'll be pretty tough. I'm not sure how good these horses are overall, but I just thought it was an interesting race from a pace and trip perspective. At Aqueduct on Saturday, we did see 2 much faster races for older horses, one for New York breds and one for Open Company, both going 7 furlongs. And these got some pretty hefty Timeform US speed figures.
They did, and I'll be honest, when I made these, and before I get into these, I do want to mention that the favorite you mentioned from the Franklin Square, that is definitely a race I need to revisit on the figure. I gave that race a big figure. I know the horse had some trouble, but it hasn't come back well. And I do want to say I'm not afraid to admit maybe I blew one, and I definitely want to give that race a second look. I'm surprised I haven't heard from you on that one yet. But,
well, I mean, it's been, I wanted to kind of wait and see how it pans out because the race did feature a very fast paced. And I know anybody who's making speed figures at Aqueduct this winter is just kind of banging their head against the wall because it does seem like the track's been changing a lot throughout the day and it's hard to make comparisons. And sometimes you do just have to wait and see if horses come back to these figures that they're running.
Right. And that's exactly the case with this one. So anyway, on to these allowance races. When I sat down and got ready to do the work, race 3 really jumped out. The Arthur's Hope win. Big jump up for the top, well, for the winner, and a move up for the ones below them. And at first I was like, well, it's, 7 furlong. Most of the other sprints were 6 furlong. So I was leaning towards, breaking it out from the others and kind of rating it on its own. But then race 7 happened, and it was also at 7 furlongs. It was a good, solid group with a good history. And, that race was faster than this one. And otherwise, there was no real reason to think the race deserved a breakout. So I just went ahead and rated the races by the clock. And the race 3 got a little bit faster, 124 compared to 121 for race 7. But, these were just some fast races.
Yeah, Arthur's Hope is a kind of a funny horse because he's a little inconsistent. You never really know what you're going to get from him since he came to this country because he won a bunch of races in Panama, I believe, prior to making a U.S. campaign. And 2 back, or rather 3 back now, prior to the dud performance that he had coming into this race. I mean, he beat Syndergaard by a nose, maybe he was second. He was second to Syndergaard by a nose, and ran extremely well. And Syndergaard's obviously come back to get into top form. I mean, he photoed with Honor Up the other day, who's a New York bred, or not a New York bred, a Michelle Nevin trained New York based horse who's in very good form right now as well. And I just think that Arthur's Hope, rather. I keep calling this horse Arthur's Tail. He was an old Tom Abertrani horse. Arthur's Hope is a horse that does have a lot of ability. And when he's on, he can be tough to beat. I know Charlie McCoy was coming off a big win for Michelle Nevin and was the big favorite in this race. And some were kind of disappointed with the ride that Jose Lescano gave him, not going after Arthur's Hope early. But Arthur's Hope was setting a pretty legitimate pace. I mean, he just kind of ran a hole in the wind. So I don't think it's any, knock on the tactics on the runner-up. Arthur's Hope was just kind of uncatchable.
Yeah, and Arthur's Hope is an interesting horse to look at from our speed figure perspective, in that the race you mentioned when he lost by a nose to Syndergaard, he got a 109 Timeform US speed figure. Next time out, he said, he dueled on a much faster pace in virtually race of identical conditions. It was over a muddy track, but with a faster pace, he was beaten 8.5 lengths, but he actually got a 112 for that effort. So if you looked at our figures, he actually moved forward a little and looked to have some upside, and it just, our speed figures give a different look than a lot of other ones out there. And this is one of the ones where I like to see it.
Yeah, and speaking of those comparisons, Sir Ballantyne in the 7th race, also at 7 furlongs, he's the one that actually ran a slightly faster time than Arthur's Hope, but he did earn a slightly slower Timeform speed figure because that's often going to be the case with closers. And also the pace of this race was just not nearly as fast. I don't think it was color-coded blue in the PPs, but it was on the slower side. Originally watching this race, I had thought that Al Mithmar, who finished second, had run, really well because he had kind of made the first move into the pace and had taken the race over a little too soon. But on rewatching it, he kind of was with the flow of the pace more. And Sir Ballantyne, I mean, horses like him are not supposed to be able to run the entire field down when the pace never develops, as it really didn't in this race. And he didn't. I mean, he ran obviously the best race of his career, I think, cutting back to the 7 furlongs. And Danny Gargan, I mean, he's been having a stellar meet at Aqueduct, and he just got this horse to keep improving.
Yeah, he did. I know you're a Danny Gargan fan. I know we're both looking forward to Tax running back. But, yeah, it was a good race. Like you said, he did kind of go a little bit against the flow. The pace was, I would say, average. It's definitely not coded in blue. But solid effort. Just 2 fast races, I think, that'll, for the class, it'll definitely be interesting going forward.
Yeah, I don't know if either of these horses really have, true stakes potential. We'll see. Maybe Arthur's hope in some New York bred stakes races, but they both ran very well on this day. Another allowance race that I think we should touch upon going out to Santa Anita was Stormy Liberal's loss on Friday, going 5 furlongs, and I believe the first race on the card. There was kind of a weird incident in this race coming to the top of the stretch that was very concerning for some of the people watching the race live. The horse came out of the race fine, but he wasn't able to get the job done. He did lose in this prep for his next trip to Dubai.
Yeah, it's the second loss in a row since winning the Breeders' Cup Sprint. I won't be betting them in Dubai, that's for sure. Well, obviously, I'm not going to Dubai, but I will be able to bet on the races. I generally don't like our horses shipping over there on turf, even in sprint races. I don't remember how he did last year. I know he didn't win. I think he ran fairly well.
He ran well. Both he and the other horse that Peter Miller took over, whose name is escaping me now.
Is it Richard's kid?
Yeah, Richard's boy or Richard's kid.
Richard's boy.
Yeah,
Richard's boy, yeah.
I think they finished second and third last year.
But, they'll get over bet here like the American horses always do. So I'll probably be against them. I mean, he's a good horse. The incident probably did cost him the win. It looked like he slipped a little bit. It looked like he was having trouble. But the way he finished, I assume he's fine physically. It just looked like maybe his feet got out from under him. And, Eddie Haskell's a horse that's in really good form. He's probably not a graded stakes type horse that beat him, but he's certainly a solid enough horse. And I'll be against Stormy Liberal, but I'll still root for him a little bit as an American interest.
Yeah, it just kind of goes to show how little margin for error there is in these turf sprints. It's just that minor incident. I mean, it didn't look minor, but I don't think it cost him a ton of momentum. It basically cost him the race, that incident at the top of the stretch. And while it did look very scary, I mean, his legs just kind of, came out from under him. And if you're watching the replay, you kind of see this giant football-sized clod of turf get kicked up right after that. So the horse just kind of completely broke underneath him, and it could have been a much scarier incident than it was. But he got back on track fairly quickly and got back into stride. But, maybe the horse was, a little careful after that and didn't get back up to his full speed. You don't really know what the situation was, but he did lose this race. And, I think he'll be fine going to Dubai. I think the fact that they're going to go with him and they're so, immediately saying that is a good sign. The turf sprints over there, I think they're okay for the Americans, the straightaway course, if they can handle it. He's probably going to be a shortish price in all the American pools, but he's a horse that shows up every time. I don't expect him to ever run back to that gigantic Beyer speed figure that he earned in the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint, but he's very consistent otherwise.
He is. I just want to make a quick note before we move on. We don't have any pace figures for this race, which is unfortunate. I think they ran a sub 21 opening quarter, so I'd like to see what it would have been, but we just don't have enough data for these 5 furlong turf races at Santa Anita yet there to really put any kind of number on it. At some point, maybe we can go back and do it as the database gets built up, but they've only run it a few times, and with the rails moving on turf, it just takes a little bit longer to build up a baseline. And we don't have it yet.
Yeah, that's a good point, because you really do have to make comparisons to make those pace figures, and there's just no comparisons to make this early on in running those races at that distance. The final stakes race from the past weekend that we'll discuss as we kind of bookend this podcast with 2 races from Sunland Park is the Currabot handicap, which is run on the same card as the Mind That Bird Derby that we began with, and a horse that I know that you've been a little bit of a fan of, Runaway Ghost. He got the job done again, 2 for 2 since coming back from the layoff, though I don't know if this was as visually impressive as his return race.
No, I mean, he was 1-9 in here. He was ridden like a 1-9 shot. He won, he had some merging, but he did win fairly easily. He only got a 113 TimeformUS speed figure for the day, so I was a little excited for him when he ran a 118 and a 6 furlong race off the long layoff, but I'm going to need to see more from him. The only horse we have to really compare him to this week is Prince Lucky, and that one was obviously much more impressive. I imagine that Runaway Ghost will stick to Sunland Park until he gives them a reason to ship out, and this is probably a race that didn't happen.
Yeah, I agree. He's going to have to do better if they kind of ship him to a circuit like Southern California or another, graded stakes type of race. The pace of this race was fairly slow for at least the first quarter mile. They went the first quarter much slower than the Mind That Bird Derby. And then they kind of progressively went quicker from there. But I do think that slow opening quarter favored the horse that was on the lead, American Dubai, who is capable of running a very big figure when things go his way, as they did in this race. So maybe it's okay that Runaway Ghost had to work a little harder to run down that horse. But I agree. This horse who likes to win races, like the Mind That Bird Derby winner, is going to have to run faster if he ships out of town.
Right. And this is just a case of where, when this horse shows up again next, I'm not going to expect them to run a 113. I'm going to expect them to run maker trying to project figures. It's a case where I don't think the figure really tells the whole story, but I still would have liked to have seen a little bit more from him. Yeah,
I completely agree. I don't know if he's really got graded stakes in his future, but we'll see. Horses can always improve. That was all the stakes action from the past weekend. It was kind of a slow weekend in terms of graded stakes races. We only had two, just the Howell's Hope and the Buena Vista. But we're coming up on March next week, and there are going to be a ton of Derby preps taking place. I'll kind of catch you off guard. And any impressions of Hidden Scroll stepping up in the Fountain of Youth? I know he's a horse that a lot of people are very excited about. People were even more excited after seeing his last workout at Payson Park down in Florida, where he easily outworked another Bill Mott horse, just well in hand. I think it's a good sign that Bill Mott's taking this next step right off that maiden victory. But all eyes are going to be on him, I think, when he goes to the start in the Fountain of Youth.
It is. And, his race has come back strong so far from the couple that have run back. And, he's got that it factor that people just kind of jump to. He ran fast. He ran well. And, it'll be really nice to see him run well. It would be good for the sport, I think. I'm not one of these ones that, superstars are going to drive the sport to the brink, but it never hurts to have them. It never hurts to have your sport in the news.
Yeah, and I mean, with Justify coming off that maiden win last year to go right into, a allowance race and then one race later be the Kentucky Derby winner, I think maybe Bill Mott's not so scared to kind of run a lightly raced horse or put him on this path to a race like the Kentucky Derby, because he obviously has the ability and based on what we've seen so far, there's no reason why he can't get there as long as he handles a fast track and more distance. So I'm very interested to see what goes on with this horse, because I'm always very skeptical of sloppy track wins, especially when there might be a track bias in place, as there may have been on Pegasus World Cup Day where this horse debuted. But just from what I've seen of this horse and the way that he moves and just his overall upside even after that debut, I think this horse might be the real deal. We'll have to see. It seems like it's going to be a strong competitive field. Horses certainly aren't ducking a maiden winner coming into the Fountain of Youth. But it's going to be I'm intrigued, to say the least.
Yeah, and I think he's going to, I haven't seen the entries yet. The entries aren't out, but I haven't seen who all's going to be in there. But I'm sure he's going to come up against some decent horses, and he's definitely going to have to have his running shoes on. They're not going to hand it to him because he won his maiden race first time out. I'm sure he'll get challenged, and it'll be good to see how he does. I'm really looking forward to it.
Yep, we'll be discussing that race next Tuesday when we record the next episode of the TimeformUS Pacecast. And I think that's all we've got for this week. So thanks for listening, everybody. As always, you can check out this podcast and other DRF podcasts on drf.com, also Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or SoundCloud. Search for Daily Racing Form and listen to everything we have to offer, including our weekly segment on all of those channels. And thanks for listening, guys. We'll see you next week.